This podcast is brought to you in partnership with EVA International Media Limited. Hello and welcome to Down to Earth with Terry Birch, where we talk about what matters down here on planet Earth and also up in space today. I've got Jeff Kluger back on the show. Jeffrey Kluger is an editor-at-large at Time Magazine and also the author of numerous books, including Lost Moon, which was the basis for the Apollo 13 movie, and his latest novel, Holdout, came out last year. He also authors a weekly space newsletter that's found at time.com, and I highly recommend you go check out Jeff Kluger's weekly space newsletter. It's a great way to find out what's going on in space. So Jeff, thanks for coming on and welcome back.
Thank you. It's good to be back. Thanks for having me.
So we're recording this at a weird time in that Artemis scrubbed the first time and it's about to launch hopefully in a couple days. So depending on when this drops, there may be breaking news about Artemis, but where we are today is we're awaiting launch. So what's the latest on that?
The latest that I've heard is that the launch window opens. I think the launch is targeted for 2:27 p.m. The time could be wrong. This coming Saturday. And they've got a window that opens 2 days after that. And if they miss that one, they'll probably have to roll it back to the vehicle assembly building and recondition it and wait for an October launch. So the hope is really that it'll get off the pad this time and get through that trans-Earth, trans-lunar window so that they can make their 6-week orbital mission.
It's going to be a long mission. Yeah, 6 weeks. So I've been thinking about this for the orbital mechanics. During Apollo, the launch window made sense because they had to land, in the morning moon time.
Right.
So that it was, and then in a lunar day lasts a month. And so
right.
if you don't want to be there right at sunrise or sunset or at nighttime. And so there's only a few days a month that Apollo could launch. But since this is going orbital, it seems like you'd be able to launch every day. You just wait until the Earth's, the Earth and moon have the same geometry and you launch.
That's right. Yeah.
So I don't know why there's range issues, like the Florida range is not available every day. And there's other launches that have to happen and you can't launch 2 rockets at the same time, I guess. But
right. Yeah.
Do you know why do they have this window?
I honestly don't know the reason that the window is so narrow. It's the relative positions of the Earth and the Moon, as you say, but you're absolutely right that they don't have to have anywhere near the same considerations that the Apollo crews had to have when they landed, right. Because not only did they need to land, obviously, in a daylit portion of the moon, but they also had to land when the shadows weren't too steep and weren't too shallow, right. In order to be able to, get an accurate sense of the terrain. It's the same thing as when you're skiing, right. And if the sun is washed out, you don't get to see any shadows from any of the moguls or bumps, and it's a lot harder to navigate than it is when you've got some pretty sharp shadows and you can see what's ahead of you.
Well, that's a question I have. I need to ask one of the Artemis guys. The moon is not exactly over the equator. It's inclined a little bit. It's right. Like 5 or 6 degrees or something. So, but if you're not landing, it shouldn't make that much of a difference. And anyway, it's an interesting question.
Yeah, and they're making a really looping trajectory around the moon. Yeah. It goes as low as 60 miles and as high as I think 42,000 or 46,000 miles away from the moon. So it's 2 great swooping loops, which accounts for the 6-week journey. Apollo 8 went out to the moon they launched on the 21st of December 1968, and they were home by the 27th, and they made 10 orbits of the moon, but they made 10 very tight orbits, 60 miles, 60 nautical miles down,
right.
The entire way. So this is a much more relaxed, much more loopy trajectory.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, that's what Gateway is going to be.
Yeah.
So let's talk about Gateway. I've written op-eds about Gateway. I spoke at the White House to Vice President Pence about my thoughts on Gateway. But can you describe the basics of what Gateway is?
Well, Gateway will be in a near rectilinear halo orbit, which
Why not a rectilinear? Why is it near rectilinear?
that is a really good question. I don't know why it's near rectilinear. That
These
might just
NASA acronyms kill me.
I know and it basically it's an orbit around the moon that allows you to change not just your altitude rather, but also your inclination, which means that you can land from a near rectilinear halo orbit. You can land anywhere on the lunar surface. You can aim yourself for anywhere on the lunar surface, which is great. Gateway will basically be a mini space station orbiting the moon that will be used as a way station, as a jumping off point for astronauts going down to the surface and coming back. But my understanding, Terry, is that, as you once put it, somebody has to be willing to say the baby is ugly. And you are not a big fan of Gateway.
I'm not. It's some people call it ISS 2.0. It's really ISS 0.5 because it's much smaller. But you made an interesting point in that Apollo could only land near the equator just because the direction you take off from Earth from Florida near the equator means that you go into orbit around the moon near the equator. But because Gateway is so far away and it's moving so slowly, it's really easy to change planes, like to go north and south if you're really far away from something. If the shuttle's at altitude, it was so close to Earth, moving so fast, it couldn't really go left or right. But if you're at geosynchronous, if you're tens of thousands of miles away, it's easier. So Gateway does make you do that. But the big problem I have with Gateway, I remember when it came out, and I talked to the gentleman here at NASA who designed the Gateway mission, and we were talking one day, and I said, we've been funding SLS and Orion. SLS was born as Ares 5 back in 2005.
Yeah.
NASA often says it was born in 2011. It was born in 2005. They just changed they changed the acronym.
Right.
We've been funding these things for a decade, and they don't have a mission. If you remember the whole, basically, Obama presidency, there was no mission.
There was no mission for the hardware. Yeah. I mean, there was the asteroid redirect mission, which was, I ran a piece in Time and called it NASA's long strange trip. Nobody believed that was going to make a shred of sense.
Right. I know. It was so funny because when I went to headquarters during that time, and remember the rover we had in Constellation, astronauts would crawl in the back. It was a really cool rover. You could drive it here at JC. I drove the thing on these giant piles of rocks. It was really cool. They had taken the model of the rover at headquarters, and they took the wheels off the model and they put on some claws. So it was the same. It was the moon rover with claws that were going to grip an asteroid.
Yeah.
Which would be cool. I just don't think that was a good primary mission. But anyway.
Yeah.
So what my friend told me was that headquarters called and said, hey, we have the big rocket and we have Orion and we don't have a mission for it, which was very obvious. And no one ever was saying that out loud. And so he's like, what do you think? And he had on his whiteboard Gateway, and it was a modular approach. It was basically the space station. It was having different international partners contributing modules to build a space station.
Right.
And I was like, that would work. That would provide lots of jobs for several decades. It would allow lots of countries to contribute. There's no new technology. It's the same exact stuff that they already know how to build. So it's not going to advance anything. It's just going to provide the same government jobs that we've had since the 90s. And if you want to actually go to the moon, now you have to go to Gateway, which could take you a week or more to get there.
Right.
Going to the moon only takes 3 days. Going to Gateway takes longer. And time is money, especially in space.
Yeah.
Because you need more oxygen and water, and at hundreds of thousands of dollars a pound.
Right.
That really increases the cost of a mission.
Sure.
And those guys are getting fried by radiation the whole time they're out there in deep space.
Yeah. So what is the purpose of Gateway then? Do you think it really is just a jobs creator? Or do you think that there was something smarter and more technologically or exploratorily cunning behind it?
The day I spoke at the Space Council, I started getting text messages from my NASA friends at headquarters. Hey, Terry, let's talk. And I was happy to talk with them. I just don't agree with it. I mean, to your point, if you're at the Gateway, if you're on the Gateway, you can go to the North or South Pole.
Right.
If you launch from Earth, you can go to the North or South Pole. It's just going to require some propulsion to get there.
Right.
They also want to have a reusable lunar lander. And so the gateway is a place that lunar lander can stop at. But then you're having to have an orbital vehicle that maintains all this propellant. The propellant just doesn't show up in lunar orbit. It has to be launched from Earth.
Sure.
It has to be maintained. The equipment to transfer it has to be maintained.
Right. It has to be replenished.
Yeah. If you wanted a lunar lander in orbit, you could just have a lunar lander in orbit with some small service module with solar panels or something like that.
Yeah.
And so you have to spend years building this thing, which is going to cost billions of dollars. And then in my article, I was a little bit of a smart aleck, but I said, it's fine. We could, if you could just build Gateway and then get rid of it, it wouldn't be that bad. But the really bad thing is that you're going to have to keep on maintaining it.
You have to maintain it.
And it's going to cost billions of dollars to maintain this thing.
Right.
And it's going to slow you down. Like the orbit that they picked, I don't know if you know this, that near rectilinear halo high altitude. The reason they picked that is because that's the only as far as the European service module can get.
Oh, is that true? That's the reason they picked that, because of the limits in the service module.
The service module doesn't have enough delta V to get closer to the moon.
Right.
Now, being farther away from the moon makes it easier to maneuver, but when we went to the European service module, we lost a lot of capability. And delta V, and that's not something that's reported very much. So we have, I mean, look, it would be really fun to go fly on a mission and be close to the moon. That would be really fun. Or to get to go land on the moon. That would be fun. But the way we're doing it is just incredibly expensive. And the other problem, I know you've heard me, and my fans have probably heard me say this before. The big lesson after Columbia was separate crew from cargo.
Right.
They didn't say that in the CABE report, but the admiral said it, like, in the public. That was the discussion.
Right.
When you put the space shuttle on the big rocket with the crew, that's dangerous, and we lost 2 of them, which is why Constellation had a small human rocket with the capsule and a big cargo
rocket, the Ares 5 and the Ares 1.
Exactly. So when under Bolden and Laurie Garver and during the Obama years, they canceled Constellation.
Right.
Because that was George W.'s program, and that allowed Elon to have a reason to send people.
Right.
It allowed SpaceX to have that, but they didn't cancel Constellation. Everything stuck around, except for the Ares 1 rocket. We still have Orion. We still have the big rocket, except they took the capsule off of the small rocket and they put it on the big rocket.
Put it on the big rocket. Yeah.
So now the big rocket should be able to bring, I don't know what, like 80,000 pounds or
I think it's 80,000 pounds. Yeah.
Yeah. Once you get the bigger upper stage, if we ever get that, that's billions of dollars away.
Right.
Something like 100 or 120,000 pounds to the moon. That's a lot of mass. Unfortunately, it's all taken up, or largely taken up, with Orion, because it's such a big and heavy capsule. So what was going to be launch your big moonship, launch your people, have them rendezvous, and then go to the moon or Mars or wherever you're going, has now become launch the people with very little excess spare capacity.
Right. Which is not unlike the way the Saturn V worked, although as you're quite right that the Apollo crew vehicle was much smaller than the Orion crew vehicle, but basically, this was the throw for the Apollo for the Saturn V was everything you needed to get to the moon was on top of that solitary rocket. You had your lunar module with both its ascent and descent module, and you had your Apollo crew and command module and service module, and it was all atop a single rocket. It was a really simple way to go, and it was a really effective way to go. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that we've reinvented the wheel and, done so in a way that adds multiple steps and adds multiple components that take what was once a very simple premise and make it a much more complicated premise.
It's definitely not the KISS principle for sure.
Yeah.
And imagine, Jeff, if we had the Saturn V today. If we had the Saturn V in the 90s, we could have built the ISS in 3 or 4 assembly flights.
Right. Sure.
And we'd have a heavy lift vehicle.
Yeah, yeah. It's continues to mystify me that the Saturn V, that we simply effectively tore up the blueprints and, built, what did we build? 15 of them and 3 are in museums, or 14 of them and 11 launched and 3 are in
Yeah.
museums. It's extraordinary to me that we had this asset that we could have built on, we could have improved on.
Oh
Imagine
yeah.
the Saturn V with
Could have had
half
a
a
Saturn
century.
6. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, with half a century's worth
Yeah.
of innovations. I once asked Elon Musk. We were sort of, swapping opinions about rockets and spacecraft, and I asked him what he thought of the Soyuz, and he said, "Well, it's not much, but they've optimized the hell out of it." And that is true. When you have a rocket and
Yeah.
a spacecraft that you've been iterating since, what was its first flight was 1966 or 1967, and you've essentially had it
Yeah.
all those years, it just gets better and better and better. Well, the Saturn V and an Apollo command and service module, with 50 years of improvements and iterations and innovations, would have been a hell of a machine to have today.
When the Ares 5 mandate was designed to use shuttle components, they needed the SRB. The main tank is built at Michoud, the same place that makes the space shuttle external tank. Those solid rocket motors are Thiokol.
Right.
And it's all throwaway. And the original Ares 5 was RS-68, which is kerosene engines, pretty cheap,
right?
Relatively cheap engines for big giant rocket engines.
Right.
I was the SLS guy. I was the astronaut office SLS representative in 2011. I spent a year in that job, flying up to Huntsville to talk SLS stuff.
Yeah.
And they had a big gap between how much budget they had and how much budget they needed. There was literally a curve, right, and there was a gap. And in order to meet that gap, they decided to replace the RS-68 with the RS-25, the SSME, the space shuttle engine, which is the best rocket engine ever built. The space shuttle main engine is incredible. It's liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen, and it's incredibly expensive. I mean, it's the most, like, I guess, thrust per pound or whatever. It's a really thrust to weight ratio. It's a really amazing engine, and it's also super expensive. And we also had 15 of them laying around or whatever.
Yeah, there's a piece that I've got coming out this week in Time that is pegged to, well, it was pegged to the launch of SLS. Now it's pegged to the imminent launch of SLS. We had to do a lot of last minute rejiggering of the opening paragraph in order to, originally we said the rocket that launched this morning. Now we have to say the rocket that is intended to launch on Saturday, September 5th, or whatever the exact date is, September 3rd. But Jim Free, one of the deputies in that program, said we had 18 SSMEs, space shuttle main engines, just lying around gathering dust. So, why not use them? That was the mandate from NASA. Use the hardware we've got rather than go out and buy the RS-25s.
And that the RS-68s, the gap went away for the first 3 flights, or 4 flights. And then after that, they're going to refurbish some engines that weren't really supposed to fly again. But then after that, you're flying the world's most expensive rocket engine. And eventually I think in the Block 2 SLS, they want to go to 5 main engines instead of just 4. So that'll add 25% extra bonus cost. And so by having these solid rocket boosters, and the world's most expensive first stage, and now the whole thing has to be human rated. The other thing is you only have to human rate the small rocket. So it's smaller, it's safer. And if human rating adds 20%, let's add 20% to a small number rather than 20% to a big number.
Right.
So
sure.
The decisions that they made back in 2010-ish, 11-ish, were just awful for the future. They were good for now because they get cheaper SLS, but they're really not good for the future. So anyway. Yeah,
well, we've got cheaper SLS until we've thrown away the 18 engines that we've got. And then, you're going to get a serious cost spike. And that is another thing. I spoke to John Honeycutt, the head of the SLS program, and both he and Jim Free, we talked about reusability. And, they said, that simply was not part of our menu of options, reusability. And that's one of the reasons that, I wonder, even as we build this 8.8 million pounds of thrust rocket, the largest and most ambitious rocket that's ever been built, with its 4 SSMEs and its 2 solids. We've got, Elon Musk preparing to launch the Super Heavy with 33 Raptor engines and 16 million pounds of thrust. And, you just wonder if, it's insane. It's a beast. And you just wonder, assuming it works, and that's a big assumption, you got 33 engines that have to work correctly. Assuming it works, SLS will only have a very short period as the debutante before it's taken over by this vastly bigger, vastly more powerful and reusable rocket.
Yeah, that we should have just built the Saturn V again. Should have just built the Saturn V. I'm not even convinced right now. There's this concept of sunk cost.
Right.
And it's something that's really hard for people to understand. A sunk cost is sunk. You can't go back and ever get it back. And so you need to make what's the smartest decision for the future, not make decisions just because you've already spent a lot of money.
Right.
It's true in life. It's true in your relationships. It's true in a lot of things. Right. And it's true for this big rocket. And I am not convinced that dusting off those blueprints with 3D manufacturing, what relativity is doing now, with modern electronics, modern wiring, we could take tens of thousands of pounds off of that Saturn V vehicle, and it would be a fraction of the cost of what the SLS is. And I bet you it would compete with Elon's rocket, because having 33 giant engines firing at the same time and trying to bring those big things back to Earth, the reusability will be great if it works. But man, those are some tough challenges. SpaceX might get it done. But the real driver for that rocket, the BFR or
BFR,
big heavy, there's different names.
Super Heavy.
Super Heavy. The real driver is Starlink. He really he's bleeding cash, and he needs to get those Starlink satellites up.
And
this is, I can't imagine. I mean, the Falcon launches 40 of them or something. So giant rocket. That's going to be like a science fiction movie with, I don't know how many hundreds or thousands.
What's his goal? I think 12,000, 20,000 Starlink satellites.
5 figures. It's 5 figures. Yeah.
It's 5 figures. Yeah. So if you're launching 40 at a time, that's a hell of a lot of launches you have to do, as opposed to one giant rocket, one BFR that can put up, 1,000 or 2,000 at a time. You have half a dozen launches and your work is done.
Just like the space shuttle, the space station, it took us over a decade because we were using shuttles. Had we had a heavy lift vehicle, we could have built that thing in just a handful of launches. So let's talk about space debris. I've had several guys on talking about space debris. I think it's the biggest problem facing humanity that nobody talks about. I'm going to have hopefully a former astronaut colleague of mine that's working on a startup company doing some cool stuff. Tens of thousands of satellites, and they're not, as long as they deorbit themselves, it's not that bad of a problem. As long as they can maneuver and avoid hitting other satellites and making clouds, it really isn't that big of a problem. The problem is when they just die. And somebody estimated that 30% of these things are just going to die. I mean, this is not like a 0.1%, failure rate. This is a many percent failure rate.
33% failure rate.
And you wrote about space debris recently. What's your
I mean, I think it's not just a question, of course, of these large satellites. It's a question of the, tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands. And if you count, very, very small millimeter or centimeter size bits of debris, you're up in the millions of pieces of debris. And, one of my favorite stats that came from the Apollo era was a paint chip moving at orbital velocity if it were to hit a windshield of a non-moving object, which of course doesn't happen in orbit, but just as a thought experiment, if it were to hit a windshield of a non-moving object, it would hit that windshield with the equivalent of force of a bowling ball moving at 60 miles an hour. So even these small bits of debris, if they cross orbits, if they cross orbital paths, they can become a real danger. Obviously, anything that's in the exact same orbit, everything is moving at the same speed and maintaining a constant distance. But as one of these things loses velocity and tries to enter the highway of a lower orbit, that's where you get these collisions that can take place. So it's not just the big things, it's the small stuff too.
On my shuttle flight, I remember looking, every day I go up to the cockpit and do my stuff and look out.
Yeah.
And one day there was a little moon crater, right? There had been an impact on the window and with rays going out.
Wow.
We saw a couple on that flight. And on the space station, if you look out the cupola windows, there's all kinds of little dings on the outside. Yeah. And when I did my spacewalk, my spacewalks, I was really shocked at how many impacts there had been. There's lots of little craters on the outside of the space station.
Yeah, I remember you said it was like it was hit by birdshot.
Yeah, exactly. That's what it looks like. Yeah. So there's stuff out there. Some of it's man-made. It's leftover paint and debris from launches. Right. Some of it's just dust coming in from the solar system or maybe the galaxy. Who knows? But there is stuff. Well, the Webb telescope has been hit.
Yeah, Webb telescope has already been hit, and the Webb telescope is not in our debris field. The Webb telescope is 1 million miles from Earth, orbiting at the L2 point, and yet it's still getting hit by micrometeoroids. And they talked about the danger that, well, this is inevitable over the course of a 20 to 25 year lifespan, but it happened in the first half a dozen days.
20 to 20 days, not 20 years.
Yeah. Right, 20 days, not 20 years. So, that thing is a vulnerable piece of hardware sitting in open space, completely unprotected. I mean, say what you will, it obviously Hubble doesn't have the infrared capability, the infrared vision that Webb has, and we've seen the difference in the images that have come back when you compare images of identical objects side by side. Webb obviously has an enormous advantage over Hubble, but at least with Hubble, the mirror and the other optics are, protected inside a metal
by the big tube.
By the big tube. Yeah. I mean, it's a traditional telescope. Here, you've got no protection at all. Your sun shield is unprotected. Your instruments are unprotected, and your mirror is unprotected. And that's, 6.5 meters worth of beryllium and gold that's floating out there. That's polished to, my favorite analogy that, somebody, I don't know who came up with this, said that the beryllium mirror is polished so perfectly that if you could expand the mirror to the size of the United States, the biggest imperfection would be 3 inches tall. That's how finely polished the mirror is. So, I mean, it's hard to, I don't know who crunch those numbers, but that's how finely polished the mirror is. So if you got this thing getting tattooed by micrometeoroids, that's a problem.
So 3 inches to 3,000, that ratio. It's 0.00000%, whatever.
Right.
I mean, space debris is a problem, and what can be done about it? I mean, I think launching these mega constellations is so incredibly irresponsible.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, there's no international, and it has to be international, right?
It has to be.
There's no international organization that sets standards and holds companies or nations accountable. And there's basically a rush to get these things launched as soon as possible before that happens.
Right. That's exactly right.
Let's get them launched now for cheap, because once the regulations come. And it's not that you want to stop innovation, but in the year 2300, the people on the podcast are going to be pissed at us for having left them this giant mess.
Yeah. And that doesn't even begin to mention the threat of militarization of space.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah.
Recent military events. I have talkked about it, but do you want to?
Yeah. Well, the Chinese and the Russians have already proved their capability of, kinetic kills with
Indians too.
Indians too, yeah. Kinetic kills with missiles from Earth that can destroy a defunct satellite. And China has perfected the ability to rendezvous its satellites with its own friendly satellites for now, but they're proving the capability to come up close for a close-up kinetic kill. So you create these debris fields that, once you blow up a satellite, that's a lot of busted hardware, fragmented hardware that's flying around, spinning around, essentially, since not only is it's no longer moving in a stable orbit, you've had the energy that's been introduced into the satellite by the kinetic kill object. So you have these twirling debris fields that are created. What was a single piece of space junk, a defunct piece of a defunct satellite, is now dozens or hundreds of pieces of smaller space junk.
Right. It's an awful idea in every way. And our Chinese friends did it in 2007. They haven't done it since. And I think the general that ordered that test hasn't been heard from for a while, to be honest. But then the Indians did it in 2019. They want to join the club.
Right.
And the Russians did it this year, right before the war. They were trying to, I don't know what were they doing with that? They blew up a satellite that actually put their own cosmonauts on the ISS at risk.
At risk, yeah. Yeah, I think they were just trying to flex their muscles pre-war. I think that was just one more way of saying, we remain a global power, we remain a global superpower. I mean, look.
And they really don't, by the way.
They don't, I know. I mean, it was Barack Obama who, tweaked them or slapped them, depending upon how hard, or how seriously you think they took the offense. But he called them a respectable regional power. And
yes, I remember that.
That is, once you had this bipolar world of two great superpowers, to call them a respectable regional power that's quite a slap.
Putin stays up at night just grating his teeth when he hears that. Although Obama also mocked Mitt Romney as, laughed at him because he said that Russia was a threat. And he was like, Russia, the 1980s called and they want their fourn policy back.
They want their foreign policy back. Yeah, that quote has not aged well.
That has not aged well at all. But, I was watching, believe it or not, I was watching Red October last night.
Yeah.
And what a great book that was, man. That was I think that was Clancy's best book. I loved Red Storm Rising. I loved all those 80s, 90s books, but The Hunt for Red October is a great book. But watching that, I thought, man, the Soviet Union was evil. There's so many terrible things about it, but they had some capability, right?
Yeah.
And to think of what Putin has done to just corrupt and tear down Russia, they had legitimate reason to be proud of Yuri Gagarin and their space program and so on. And Putin's regime has just made a mockery out of it. Watching that movie really made me think of just how far Russia's fallen. If you ever have a leader that wants to make country X great again, your warning flags need to go off.
Exactly. That's right. Yeah, because that's policy made of grievance. That's policy made of perceived humiliation. The decline and the collapse of the Soviet Union was to Putin. He calls it one of, I forget what the term he used.
The worst tragedy of the last century.
Of the last century. And then you and I are speaking less than 24 hours after the death of Mikhail Gorbachev. And I would not go so far as to say that Vladimir Putin is celebrating Gorbachev's death, but I am sure he's not wearing a black armband this week either.
In general, Russians really, even like my Russian friends, they don't like Gorbachev because he ushered in the 90s, which were absolutely horrendous for Russia. They became overrun with corrupt oligarchs who took over the country. They lost their pensions. They didn't have bread. I mean, the 90s were really terrible for average Russians. Because their leaders suck. They went from communist corruption to oligarch, corruption, which was even worse for the average person. So you really need to have a functioning government. That's why I love space, and I like talking to you about fun space stuff because it's cool. But at the end of the day, like no Bucks, no Buck Rogers. It's not about the rocket science. It's about the political science, because all that cool rocket science doesn't happen unless you have good political science happening.
Politics the politics that's behind it. Yeah, there was a great quote. I'm not a big fan of George Will, but I read his column in the Washington Post yesterday on the death of Gorbachev, and they talked about, he was quoting somebody who was talking about Gorbachev's awareness of the innate shortcomings of the Soviet communist system. And Gorbachev apparently had turned up late to an embassy function one night. And he said he was late because he was dealing with a problem in the agricultural sector. And the person he was talking to, just trying to be polite, making conversations, said, "Oh, when did this problem begin?" And Gorbachev's answer was 1917.
Yeah.
So this has been something that, Gorby was never a big fan of the system. I think he was always very aware of the innate flaws of the system he inherited.
Yeah, I don't think he was like a big freedom democracy. He was in charge of the Soviet Communist Party.
Right.
But a man's got to know his limitations, to quote Clint Eastwood. And he was very aware of that. And very, very few leaders are. Leaders will take their whole nation off the cliff to feel good about themselves. And he had the self-awareness. He didn't tear the Berlin Wall down, but he didn't send in tanks to prevent it from happening. And that was
exactly right. Yeah. It was inaction that made him a hero in that case, not action that made him a hero. And now I think, look, we're seeing it with the comparison between, you can compare the Chinese and Russian economies, and you can compare the Chinese and Russian space programs. And, the comparisons are apt, because in both cases, the Chinese effectively inherited their ideas from the Russians. The Russians arrived at communism first. Now, obviously, China isn't remotely a pure communist country anymore.
Right.
It's an autocratic capitalist nation that calls itself communist.
Right.
And they inherited, their crewed spacecraft, their manned spacecraft, are effectively, just adapted Soyuzes. And yet their space program has vastly outstripped the Russians at this point. Now, they don't launch with the frequency that the Soyuz launches. They've only launched a handful of manned flights, a handful of crewed flights in the last 10, 12 years. But they have a robust program, and they have, a long-term vision. And, the supposed Beijing-Moscow collaboration to get to the moon, in that collaboration, China is clearly the senior partner, even though Russia got to space first.
I say this all the time. Our partnership with Russia has been great. It really has been a great partnership when it comes to space, which has been the only positive partnership between us and Russia for the last decade. But their future with China is going to be very different. We have a nice marriage. It's a marriage of equals right now.
Right.
That is going to be a parent-child or worse relationship. And the Russians know it, and they don't want to be partners with China. But the average engineer on the street is not like looking forward to having to deal with the Chinese. But that's the reality. They're killing. I just read an article about this 4-year-old that got ripped apart in her mother's arms.
Wow.
After they get bombed,
Ukraine.
And this is something that frustrates me. I do want to talk about China and what they're doing in space. It's important. I wrote an op-ed recently and about the Russian partnership, and it's time for us to disengage. That people ask the question, are the Russians going to pull out of the space station? I think that's the wrong question. Why are we letting this evil man who has brought war? There is a war in Europe. It is 1941. He's killing civilians. He's a terrorist nation. Why do we let them decide if we partner with them? We should be taking active measures. We should not be launching NASA astronauts on Soyuz, and Russian cosmonauts should not be launching on SpaceX. On normal times, they should. I love launching on the Soyuz. I really enjoyed my time in Russia. It's not 2015 anymore. It's 2022. and we need to be I think we need to be building a propulsion module and actively disengaging Russia. If they want to pull out of Ukraine, if they want to pay reparations, then we should bring them back.
Right.
And that's my view.
Right.
We don't have the Chinese on the space station for a reason.
Yeah.
They're committing genocide against Uyghurs. Yeah. They're stealing our intellectual property. They're launching rockets at Taiwan because a politician goes and visits Taiwan. So anyway, that's my view.
Yeah.
It's not one held by NASA, obviously, but
no, and it does. I mean, you speak of the propulsion module. It does seem like a simple technological step for us to have a reboost capacity on the American end of the space station, so we're not dependent upon the Russians any longer to keep the station in a stable orbit.
We just did that with Cygnus. The American cargo ship Cygnus just reboosted the space station.
Just reboosted the station. So
a senior person told me, "Oh, Terry, it's going to take 3 years to build a propulsion module." I'm like, if you gave Elon Musk or Northrop Grumman, who makes a Cygnus, give him $200 million, give him a bonus payment that if it's operating by New Year's Eve, it'll be operating by New Year's Eve.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. It's not a difficult engineering job at all.
No.
So, I mean, once we have that dependable permanent reboost capability, we don't need the Russians any longer. Now, clearly, they're not simply going to decouple their modules and float away. They would simply abandon the station as a whole, and the U.S. would either have to learn how to operate what are there, 5 or 6 Russian segments of the station, and either have to learn how to operate them or just shut them down and consider them dead weight. But we could continue to reboost. So that's, we essentially free ourselves from Russia once we have that permanent reboost capability.
In the context of war in Europe, and by the way, the cosmonauts, the ones who launched in the yellow and blue flight suits that were not Ukraine, that was their college colors.
Right.
These cosmonauts are very supportive of the war. They're not supportive of Ukraine at all. Right. They just sent one of the arguments is, and I'll finish my thought, space is the only thing we have left. Like that's the one area of cooperation, and we can use space, to hopefully make a difference. Well, the cosmonauts literally about a month ago just sent down a message to their troops wishing them well in Ukraine. Like they're using the ISS for propaganda to promote the war.
Well, they held up the flag of Luhansk, for God's sake, of the independent Republic of Luhansk. I mean, that was provocative in the worst possible way.
In the worst way. It's like we're doing an Arctic expedition in 1941 with German scientists.
Yeah.
I'm sure there were some, I know there are some cosmonauts who oppose the war. I know there are some Russians who oppose the war. I'm not saying that all Russians are evil people, but they haven't stopped their government from doing what they're doing.
Right.
And 3 of the cosmonauts I flew with, and I've said this a bunch of times, I'm going to say it again, I sat in the service module looking out a window in the winter of 2015, watching red flashes in Donetsk. I was looking over some photo folders for somebody that needed a photo, and I was scrolling through my photos, and I had Donetsk was one of my photos.
Wow.
In 2015. I was watching people getting killed because of Putin's war next to a cosmonaut. It was a really solemn moment. It was a really solemn moment. He's now in the Duma promoting the war. Yeah. And so the argument that, well, if we just put people in space, they're going to come back and hold hands and sing Kumbaya.
Yeah.
And I know 3 of them that are should be the most enlightened humans on the planet, and they are in the Duma now supporting the war. So that argument doesn't hold weight with me.
Except when they are aboard the station. I would think there's a lot of kumbaya when you're aboard the station because you're mutually dependent upon one another for your lives and safety.
We mutually pledge our lives, our fortune, and our sacred honor. Yeah.
And our sacred honor.
Yeah. I love hanging out with the Russians. That was my favorite thing to do at night. I would make dinner and I'd float down, and I was good friends with them. I still am.
Yeah.
I think all my crewmates have been to my house here in Houston since our flight. And that wasn't a problem. But now, I mean, they're promoting a war. They're promoting annexation of Crimea and that kind of stuff. It's just a line for me personally. I think the United States should should have a higher moral line, and certainly not. We could work with them even if we just kept them there and just minimized our cooperation. But when you send astronauts to Russia for training, are they going to end up as Brittany Griner's cellmate?
Right.
How can you say no? No, Russia would never do that. Oh, really?
Yeah.
I didn't think they were going to invade Ukraine. I didn't think they'd put Brittany Griner away for 10 years.
Convict her for 10 years. Yeah, that's true. So, although, I was just going to say, it's hard to imagine an
I don't think they'll do it.
Winding up in a jail cell.
I don't think they'll do it, but our American supplied weapons are killing Russian troops now.
Right.
And we're sending American military officers to Russia.
Right.
While our weapons are killing their troops.
Yeah. And even if it's not us, even if it's NATO, who's the senior partner in NATO? I mean, all of these, it's however.
The U.S. Biden is getting billions of dollars. I mean, these are American weapons with American dollars. And so anyway, I think we need to take a more cautious approach to the station. And I've been really disappointed that the day after they fired, I published my op-ed.
Yeah.
They fired Rogozin the next day, literally. I'm sure it was because of my op-ed.
Of course. It's direct cause and effect.
Yeah. They fire the head of the Russian Space Agency, who was a total clown. He was threatening nuclear war.
Yeah.
He was a complete horrendous human. And the new guy is trying to walk back what they were saying. My sources tell me from Energia, and they're like, no, we don't really mean 2024, because I think they know that the end of the space station is the end of their space program.
Right.
But
I mean, what do they launch? Where do they launch their Soyuz? Where do they? The only way they have a future is if somehow Soyuz has a role in some capacity in a larger enterprise with China, because launching the Soyuz will have no place to go once the space station is deorbited, and the Soyuz is all they've got left.
That's all they have. Now they could I could imagine them doing space tour, like SpaceX launches standalone inspiration mission. So that I could see them doing that, but that's not going to pay that many bills.
Right.
So it's an interesting time, and it pains me a lot, because I was the proudest accomplishment I had was being commander in 2015 when all these problems were happening.
Sure.
Our crew was cohesive, and we're still friends to this day, but I just think Ukraine is a line that has been crossed.
Yeah.
And NASA's vision is so it's so looking through a straw. It's not looking at the big. Their only goal is to make sure there's never a time when there's not a Russian and an American on the space station, which requires us to have to fly on each other's rockets.
Yeah.
And I think the death and destruction in Ukraine is more important than having to unman the station for a week or two in the really unusual, rare event that would have to happen.
Right.
That's my take.
Well, and I would think it's hard to argue with that take. An uncrewed station for a week or two after 20 years of permanent habitation, the station can maintain itself without humans aboard for a while. And we could even reboost, presumably, by remote control. You wouldn't have to be on board to reboost.
Whenever we reboosted, I didn't do anything. Yeah. It was like all of a sudden the pencil's moving. I'm like, oh, the engines are firing. It was all done by computer, by the ground. So yeah, that's something that could happen. So that kind of gets me fired up. But I want to talk about what China's doing. But before we get to what China's doing, let's talk about Webb. We talked about it getting hit by debris, but it's doing a lot more than just getting hit by debris. It's an amazing telescope.
Extraordinary machine. Yeah, I've been interviewing a bunch of folks involved in the Webb telescope and in the history of the telescope. And the mere fact that it's made it out there, the mere fact that it has had the number of near-death experiences it had. I mean, this was proposed as the next generation space telescope in 1996 at a cost of $500 million with a launch date in 2017. Well, flash forward 25 years, it launches in Christmas 2021, almost 2022, at a cost of $10 billion. And I mean, this machine had to survive everything, including Hurricane Harvey, when it was in a test chamber,
vacuum chamber.
Yeah,
I
in the
forgot about
vacuum
that.
chamber in
That was 5
Houston.
years ago this week.
Yeah, that was 5 years ago this week. That's exactly right.
Wow.
And it was in the vacuum chamber there, and they were, they needed truckloads of liquid nitrogen to keep it at 50 Kelvin, and the truckloads of liquid nitrogen couldn't get through the standing water of the rainstorm. It was just, I was speaking to somebody who was there and,
Right.
surviving on peanut butter, living outside that vacuum chamber for 5 days. And,
Right.
he said they finally got a call from the guys over at JSC in managing the space station, and they said, "We got pizza over here. Come on over, guys." So they put on their slickers and ran outside over to Mission Control, and they finally got some food.
That is a funny story. I didn't know that. After my flight in 2015, I went to Goddard. I'm from Maryland. We were always telling, we were sharing Oriole stories.
That's right.
And so I went to Goddard as part of my post flight, and I got to see Webb. It was there, and I was amazed. But I was like, how many of these mechanical mechanisms have to work? How many hundreds? And are there any and there are no backups for those things?
Yeah.
And there's no way to repair it. And how tight a tolerance does the hexagons need to come? And so I was like, wow, this is a great telescope. And as soon as I left, I called my friend John Grunsfeld, who was at headquarters as the guy in charge of Webb, in charge of science. He had been the guy in charge of Hubble. He had been the guy working on Hubble on several shuttle flights as a spacewalker. John, do you know that do you realize that? Yes. And I just think an army of people haven't slept for the last 8 years because we had this one bomb called CBU 87 that all these different things had to happen, and we called it like the 87 you needed 87 miracles for the bomb to actually work, and Webb you needed like 1,000 miracles, and they worked.
There were 344. There were 344 single point failures alone, just in the deployment. This has nothing to do with the construction. This has nothing to do with the launch. This has nothing to do with it's separated from the Ariane 5 and floating in space. You then had to unfold the damn thing, and you had 344 single point failures, and they retired them all. It was extraordinary.
It is well done. Hopefully those guys are on a beach in the Bahamas right now or something, because they need a vacation. But I've had Grunsfeld on, I've had Katie Mack on, Jim Head from Brown University. I've had a couple of astronomers on the podcast. Yeah. And the way I look at Webb, there's really three things. Because it's infrared, it looks really far back in time, because the farther things are away, the faster they're moving away from us, and the light moves in the red direction. It's called a red shift. So it looks back in time at the early universe. That infrared can look through dust clouds, so it can look at a nebula or whatever. And then the other thing it can do is it can look at planets and their atmospheres and figure out what kind of atmosphere. We just saw that this past week. And so I don't know if you can talk about those things. I think I don't know which one is coolest, but it does have some interesting things. Although I'll say this up front. I remember going to the Space Telescope Science Institute in Baltimore. It's the organization that runs the space telescope, the Hubble. At the time, it was Hubble. And I met the guy that does the photoshopping of these images. Yeah. And so the images that we see on the cover of Time magazine are not the images that the telescope takes. Indeed. Hate to bust your bubble, but yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of the colors are assigned, obviously. The colors are assigned based upon the elements that are in the clouds. So you will decide that helium is yellow and hydrogen is blue, and, dust clouds are going to be red. And, these are colors that are artificially assigned. But in fairness, that's how all pictures have come back from the very first Mariners and Voyagers. These were all assigned colors, because these images come back digitally. They're just a series of ones and zeros that come back. They do not come back in color, but you can tell from spectroscopy what the chemical makeup of various parts of an object, or in the case of a nebula, a very large mass of objects. You can tell what the chemical spectra are, and then you assign colors to the spectra. So yes, we are artificially assigning colors. What you and I see that gives us the gee whiz look, is not what Webb sees originally. A friend of mine here at Time, who was something of a cynic about Webb, and I don't agree with him, but it was funny. He said, well, they just spent $10 billion giving the world the greatest screensaver it's ever had. and
No, there's scientific data coming from it for sure.
There's plenty of scientific data coming from it,
right.
Yeah.
But
and merely from the from what was it, WASP 96C or something, what are WASP 9B?
I think 39B.
39B, yeah. Just the spectra that they've got of the atmosphere. They've discovered water vapor, they discovered CO2, they discovered, I think, methane in the atmosphere. So,
right.
They discovered a lot of the raw material of biology in the very first atmosphere they studied. And Bill Nelson, I was doing an interview with him about the SLS, and he said, as an aside, and he was not off the record, so I'm not speaking out of turn here. Mm-hmm. He said, and just as a sneak preview, he said, the next image you're going to see from Webb is going to be the first actual image of an exoplanet, not simply a spectrograph of the atmosphere, an image of an exoplanet. He said he himself has not seen it, but he's told that it's going to be released, that it'll be in the next batch.
You heard it here first.
Yeah.
It's a scoop. I'm getting my reporter instincts.
Yeah, I was really pleased he said that. And I was really pleased he did not say the words, this part is off the record. So that was part of our conversation.
And this is not his first rodeo. He knows when it's time to say that, and he knows when it's not time to say that. Wow.
Well, that's exactly right.
I can't wait to see that. And that's interesting because infrared, because that's a longer wavelength, it doesn't have as much resolution as visible. And right. So it's actually hard. It's harder to get that. That's why the mirror is so big, in part because of that.
Yeah.
Wow. That'll be super exciting. It's kind of like, but what my point was, like, if you were in a spaceship at the beginning of the universe, or if you were in a spaceship around a nebula or around Jupiter,
right,
what you saw with your eyes would be different than the pictures that you get, but that's okay. I think they're doing it with good. They're doing it with, there's a purpose behind it, like you said.
Right.
And I love this unmanned stuff that they're doing. I know I have to let you go here soon, but the Russian cosmonaut, what happened with that spacewalk? I did not hear this story.
Yeah, there was a power problem with the spacewalk. There was a power with the Orlan suit. And there was either a short or a near blackout of the suit. Now, I don't know. At the very least, this was on a spacewalk that took place within the last 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. And at the very least, there was a risk of a loss of communication, which would have meant he would have not only been able not to talk to the other cosmonaut who was out on the spacewalk with him, mm-hmm. but he would not have been able to talk to the ground and would not have been able to talk to the crew remaining inside the space station. Right. But a power loss in communication could quickly cascade to a power loss on the Orlan suit entirely. So they said to him very clearly, drop whatever you are doing and get inside now. And he did that quickly. So it was a little bit of a sort of harken back to Luca Parmitano and his near drowning in space. And what was that, 2014, I believe, when his helmet filled with water?
I think it was right before I flew, because we were hyper aware of water in the helmet. He had a really bad leak. It filled his helmet up, not entirely, but it shorted out his comm, so he couldn't talk.
Right.
He couldn't see because he was getting water in his eyes. Luca was in a really bad way. And we came up with we have a little snorkel, so you could go down and breathe in the snorkel. Right. And it went down to your legs, where there's you're not gonna have a water leak down there.
Right.
And we had this pad that was like a diaper in your helmet. And so we were hyper aware of it. And on my second spacewalk, I was coming inside, and I had a spacesuit that was a known leaker. It was like you get humidity on your Coke.
Right. Yeah.
It had that kind of problem, which is not a bad leak. The leak that Luca had was actually a different kind of leak. And on my way in, I was like, I could see my visor was getting full of water, and I just thought, well, water's dripping down just like after on a hot, humid day.
Yeah.
And then I was like, wait a minute, I'm in space, water doesn't drip, and my whole visor was covered. And then I was like, squish, squish, squish. My helmet was all covered, and so I said, hey, Houston, there's a little bit of water. And Anton Shkaplerov, super smart, he got a syringe. And as soon as they took the helmet off, he measured the amount of water. Yeah. And because of that, they they narrowed it down to the not bad kind of leak as opposed to the bad kind of leak. And I went outside in the same suit a couple of days later. But anyway, I did not know this Russian guy had that problem.
Yeah, that was a pretty scary moment, but happily he made it back inside in time. And his spacewalking colleague of his who was out with him, they just terminated the EVA, and he came back inside. So
my crewmate Samantha Christofretti went out with the Russians. Was it before or after that electrical problem?
I don't know. When did she go out?
In the last few weeks for the European robotic arm. They finally, after 10 years, they finally got that arm.
Well, I know that these two guys were working on the robotic arm as well. So it had to have been really close to it. I don't know if it was before or after the robotic arm, but they were working on the arm as well. And they had just gotten some insulation off it. And they had just gotten a binding strip, something that had held it in place to free up the elbow joint on the arm. They just removed that and just removed some insulation. And that's when they had their blackout. So Samantha's walk may have been after that to finish up the work that the other guys were supposed to have been able to complete during their work.
When she gets back to Earth, I'll ask her.
When did she come back?
I think October. I can't say for sure. But I'll ask her when she gets back. The electrical short problem, electrical shorts in oxygen environments are not the best.
That's a very bad thing. Yeah.
NASA's learned that. And then if you lose comm, it's not that big a deal. You look at the other guy, I'm okay. And let's go back. And you're going to lose a spacewalk, but you're not going to die.
Right.
But if you have a no kidding power failure, you might die because you need that for cooling, and you can overheat really, really quickly, especially if you're in sunlight.
Right. Yeah.
Like you might overheat within minutes. That's so losing. You hear this little bzzz with the fan spinning.
Yeah.
And if that bzzz ever stops, that's a very bad day. You need to get inside as soon as you can. So, Jeff, thanks so much. I want to talk about Europa, but I know we have deadlines and
we've got a little tightness on deadlines here, but Europa, we're launching the Clipper. So the Europa Clipper will launch, when is it? 2024, I think it's set to launch. And
it's coming up soon. It's going to be an orbiter, not a lander, right?
It's going to be an orbiter, not a lander, though it should be able to fly through the geysers, the plumes of water that jet out of the ice cover. And this will precedes a lander that I think is supposed to try to go out 2 years after that. I know this was written into the federal budget in 2018, I believe. I went down to Washington and met with John Culberson.
Local. I've met him here in Houston. He's not here in office anymore, but
he's not in office anymore. And he was a big he was a big NASA booster and a big Europa booster.
It should be called the Culberson mission because
it should be called the Culberson mission.
He is the sole, person responsible for making that happen. It was going to be on SLS, and they moved it to Falcon, which will add a few years of transit because it's not as powerful of a rocket, but will save billions of dollars and maybe years of launch slips. And so.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's exciting. It's the most exciting place in the universe to look for life is Europa.
Well, when it flies to that water, I wonder if they're going to find like halibut and we'll see.
Well, it's had 4.5 billion years of this salty amniotic ocean that's been pulsing around the planet thanks to the gravitational flexing, to the tidal flexing,
which warms it up.
Yeah, which warms it up. So if you can't cook up something living in warm, salty water in 4.5 billion years on a planet that has something like a heartbeat practically, you can't find it anywhere.
That's such a cool place. Although it's under like kilometers of ice, right? So there's no sun.
It's about 10 kilometers of ice. Yeah. So all of the energy comes from the tidal flexing.
Right. Yeah. There's energy. It's just not sunlight.
It's just not sunlight, but it doesn't have to be sunlight.
There's life on the bottom of our oceans where there's
where it's a complete blackout, where there's where there's no sun at all.
And if it's liquid water, it's in the 30s or 40s or 50s. Yeah. It's not like minus 300 like it is on the surface.
Well, exactly. That's right. Yeah. I mean, you or I in a wetsuit could survive in that water.
Yeah. Wow.
Pretty cool.
Well, this is such cool stuff, Jeff. We have to do this more often. And there's just a lot of cool stuff happening in space. And there's a lot of other stuff happening on Earth that is important, but it's not as much fun to talk about as space is. So
that's the truth. I love talking about space. Been talking about it since I was a kid.
Well, thanks for coming on. I appreciate it. Again, if you like space, subscribe to Jeffrey Kluger's newsletter, time.com. It's the best summary of space activities. It's fun. It's awesome writing. Like Jeff is a great writer, and it's really cool subject matter. So time.com, Jeffrey Kluger. If you like the podcast, give us a rating and subscribe. And if you don't like the podcast, don't give us a rating. We'll see you later.
It's been fun. Thank you, Terry. Thank you for having me.
Mm-hmm.